May of 2010, a retired kindergarten teacher sat down at her daughter's kitchen table in a small Tennessee town and opened a middle school yearbook. She was looking for her granddaughter's picture. Instead, she found a ghost. There, on page 41, between two strangers, was the face of a little girl who had vanished from a sidewalk in Ohio 9 years earlier. A little girl the whole town of Millfield had searched for. A little girl most people quietly believed was dead. The name printed under the photograph said Katie Sullivan. But Eleanor Voss had greeted that face at her classroom door every single morning for a year, and she knew, the way you know your own flesh and blood, that the name was a lie. The girl in the picture was Hannah Bennett. Eleanor's hands began to shake. The braces were new. The blonde hair was longer, darker at the roots. But the small scar through the left eyebrow was exactly where it had always been, and the tilt of the head, that shy little tilt when a camera pointed at her, had not changed at all. 9 years. 9 years of silence, of fading flyers, of a mother in Ohio setting a place at the table that no one ever filled. And now, in a $2 yearbook passed across a kitchen table by a 12-year-old, the answer had been sitting in plain sight, photographed, printed, and distributed to 500 families. Eleanor sat very still. If she was wrong, she was about to tear open the deepest wound a family can carry. If she was right, then a missing child was alive, going to school, taking class pictures, living 40 minutes from where Eleanor now poured her morning coffee. And someone patient and careful and invisible, had been raising her under a stolen name for nearly a decade. What Eleanor could not have known that afternoon was stranger and sadder than anything she could have imagined. The person who took Hannah Bennett was not a stranger lurking at the edge of town. She was already inside the case file, interviewed and released in the first weeks of the investigation, hiding in the one place no one thinks to look, in plain kindness, in daily routine, in the quiet trust of a small town. And the yearbook photograph that finally exposed her existed for one reason only. To keep the lie alive, she had been forced to let the truth be photographed. This is the story of a child who evaporated between one street corner and her own front porch, of a family that refused to bury an empty coffin, of a detective who kept a cold file on the corner of his desk for 9 years, because putting it in a drawer felt like surrender, and of the single glossy page that brought a stolen daughter home. Before we continue with this shocking story, subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a case like this one, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every message, and this community of people who refuse to forget the missing is the reason these stories get told. Now, to understand what that yearbook truly meant, you have to go back 9 years, to a gray October afternoon in Millfield, Ohio, in the autumn of 2001. Back to a week when the whole country was staring at its television screens, grieving a national tragedy, and a little girl's disappearance barely made the evening news. Back to 4 ordinary blocks between an elementary school and a front porch. Back to the last afternoon that Laura Bennett's life was whole, before a silence began that would split her world in two. Millfield, Ohio, was the kind of town where nothing was supposed to happen. 9,000 people, a water tower with the high school mascot painted on it, a hardware store, 2 churches, and streets lined with maples that turned the color of fire every October. Families left their doors unlocked. Children walked to school in little clusters, kicking through the leaves. Everyone knew everyone, and everyone believed that knowing everyone kept them safe. Laura Bennett was 34 that fall. She kept the books part-time at Millfield Hardware, kept the family calendar on the refrigerator, kept birthday cards addressed 2 weeks early. Her husband Stephen was 37, a line supervisor at a packaging plant in Dayton, a quiet man who showed his love by fixing things, bicycle chains, leaky faucets, the loose board on the porch step. They had 2 children. Jacob was 10, obsessed with basketball, all elbows and energy, and Hannah was 6. Hannah Grace Bennett was the child who talked to everyone. She had blonde hair her mother braided every morning, brown eyes, a gap-toothed smile she was famous for, and a small scar through her left eyebrow from the day she flew off a swing at age 4 and got up laughing. She was in 1st grade at Millfield Elementary, and she still stopped by her old kindergarten room most mornings, because her kindergarten teacher, Mrs. Voss, kept a jar of stickers on the desk and always said, "Good morning, Miss Hannah," like she was announcing royalty. Tuesday, October 9th, 2001, arrived warm and gray, the sky low and soft, the air smelling like rain that hadn't decided to fall. It was 3 weeks after September 11th, and the whole country was still holding its breath. Television stayed on all day in Millfield's kitchens and break rooms. People's eyes were on New York, on Washington, on the news crawl at the bottom of the screen. It would matter later, in a way no one could have predicted, that the nation's attention was somewhere else entirely. That morning, Laura braided Hannah's hair and dressed her in a red corduroy jumper over a white long-sleeve shirt, white sneakers with pink laces that Hannah had begged for, and her purple backpack with a little unicorn keychain clipped to the zipper. Hannah ate her cereal, fed the crusts of Jacob's toast to an imaginary dog under the table, and kissed her mother at the door. The walk to school was 4 blocks. Jacob walked her there in the morning and walked her home at 3:15. That was the rule, and it had never once been broken. Laura stood on the porch that morning, the 9th of October, and watched her 2 children shrink down the sidewalk under the flaming maples, Hannah's purple backpack bouncing, Jacob dribbling an invisible basketball. It was the most ordinary sight in the world. If you are a parent, you have watched that exact scene 100 times from your own doorway, and you have felt that small, warm certainty that your children are safe, that the distance between school and home is nothing, that the world you built around them will hold. Laura felt it too. She went inside, washed the cereal bowls, and started her day. Her birthday was that Friday. Stephen had been acting mysterious about it all week, and she remembered smiling to herself at the sink, wondering what he was planning. It was the last purely happy thought she would have for 9 years, because that afternoon, in the space of 8 minutes, between a crossing guard's wave at 3:22 and an empty front porch at 3:30, the ordinary world the Bennetts lived in was going to end without a sound. The dismissal bell at Millfield Elementary rang at 3:15. Hannah came out the front doors in the river of children, her purple backpack on both shoulders, the unicorn keychain swinging. She waited by the flagpole, the way she always did, for Jacob, but Jacob didn't come. A pickup basketball game had started behind the gym, 5th graders against 6th graders, and someone had handed him the ball. He was 10 years old. He looked at the clock, thought, Hannah knows the way, it's 4 blocks, I'll catch up. It was the kind of small decision children make every day. It would sit on his chest like a stone for the rest of his life. At 3:18, a teacher's aide saw Hannah leave the flagpole and start walking alone up Maple Street, kicking leaves. At 3:22, the crossing guard at the corner of Maple and 3rd held up her sign, walked Hannah across, and waved at her. Hannah waved back. The crossing guard would repeat that detail to detectives 100 times. She waved back. She was smiling. That was the last confirmed sighting of Hannah Bennett. From that corner, home was 2 blocks. 2 blocks of sidewalk she had walked hundreds of times. Past the hedge at the Hendersons' place. Past the blue mailbox. Around the corner onto Birchwood Lane, where her own front porch waited with the light her mother kept on. She never made the turn. At 3:30, Laura glanced at the kitchen clock. At 3:35, she stepped onto the porch and looked up the street. Leaves. Gray sky. Nobody. At 3:40, Jacob came pounding around the corner, sweaty and grinning, and the grin died on his face when his mother asked him where his sister was. At 3:41, Laura was walking fast up Birchwood. By 3:45, she was running, calling Hannah's name into the quiet, checking the hedge, checking the neighbors' yards, checking the school, the playground, the flagpole, Mrs. Voss's old classroom. Nothing. No scream had been heard. No car had squealed its tires. No one had seen a struggle. 8 minutes of gray October afternoon had simply swallowed a 6-year-old girl whole. No sound, no witness, no trace. At 4:05, Laura Bennett stood in her kitchen with the phone pressed to her ear and said the words, "No mother should ever have to arrange an order. My daughter is missing. She's 6. She was walking home from school." Her voice broke on the word school. The dispatcher kept her on the line. Stephen was called at the plant in Dayton and drove home at 90 miles an hour with his hazard lights on. The first patrol car reached Birchwood Lane at 4:14. By 5 o'clock there were 6 of them, and officers were knocking on every door on Maple, 3rd, and Birchwood. By 6, volunteers were walking the fields behind the school in a long line, calling her name into the dusk. By 8, it was raining, the rain that had been threatening all day, and every person in that line felt it like a cruelty, because rain washes away scent, washes away footprints, washes away time. Laura stood at the end of her driveway in the rain, refusing a coat, refusing to go inside, staring at the corner of Birchwood and 3rd, as if her daughter might still round it, purple backpack bouncing, 8 minutes late, and nothing more. If you have ever waited for a child who did not come home, even for 1 hour, you know the specific terror that was closing around her heart. That night it closed, and it did not open again for 9 years. Detective Ray Whitfield of the Millfield Police Department took the call at 4:40 that afternoon, And by 5 he was standing on the corner of Maple and 3rd with a photograph of Hannah in his hand. He was 44 years old, and he had spent 20 years believing he knew every dark corner of his town. He would spend the next 9 learning he was wrong. Whitfield did everything right, and it is important to say that. Roadblocks went up on the county roads by nightfall. The Amber system, still new in Ohio in 2001, pushed Hannah's description across the state. 6 years old, blonde hair, brown eyes, red corduroy jumper, white shirt, white sneakers, with pink laces, purple backpack, a scar through her left eyebrow. The next morning, a volunteer searching the Hendersons' property line found the backpack. It was lying behind the hedge at the corner of Maple and 3rd, 20 feet from where the crossing guard had waved goodbye. The sight of it, small and purple and wet from the night's rain, stopped grown men in their tracks. Inside were her folders, her pencil box, half a granola bar. Everything was there except one thing. The unicorn keychain was gone from the zipper. Investigators noted it and moved on. It seemed like nothing. It was not nothing. Tracking dogs took Hannah's scent from the backpack and followed it along the hedge, down the sidewalk on 3rd Street, and then stopped, all of them, at the same place. The curb. The scent went to the edge of the street and vanished. Dogs do not lie about that. Somewhere on 3rd Street, in the middle of a gray afternoon, Hannah Bennett had gotten into a vehicle. And here is the detail that still haunts the people who worked this case. Nobody saw it. Not one witness. A neighbor 2 houses down thought she remembered a tan or beige sedan idling on 3rd Street sometime that week. But she couldn't say what day, couldn't describe a driver, couldn't recall a plate. The tip went into the file. It would sit there, unrecognized, for 9 years, the closest anyone came to seeing the truth. The search itself was enormous by Millfield standards. 400 volunteers, helicopters from Dayton, divers in Miller Creek, twice, grid searches through the cornfields, the fairgrounds, the woods behind the water tower. Flyers went up on every pole and every shop window. Hannah's gap-toothed school picture, smiling above the word missing. But beyond the county line, the story barely existed. It was October of 2001. The nation was 3 weeks past the worst attack in its history. The networks had no airtime for a small-town girl in Ohio. The cases that get found are so often the cases that get seen, and Hannah's case was born into a great national grief that swallowed it whole. Laura did television interviews that aired once at odd hours and vanished. Stephen drove to Columbus and Cincinnati with boxes of flyers and came home with his hands still full. Whitfield worked 18-hour days. He interviewed every registered offender within 50 miles. He interviewed every teacher, every aide, every janitor, every bus driver at Millfield Elementary, 34 school employees in all, one after another, at a folding table in the gymnasium. Every one of them was polite, shaken, cooperative. Every one of them was cleared. One of them was lying. She sat across from him on a Thursday afternoon, a quiet lunchroom aide with sad eyes and a soft voice, and answered every question calmly. Interview number 31 of 34. He thanked her for her time. She said she hoped they found the little girl. Then she went home and made dinner for the little girl. Every investigation that stalls begins to feed on the people closest to it, and Hannah's was no different. 3 days in, a witness mentioned seeing Stephen Bennett's truck near the school at 3:10 on the afternoon his daughter vanished. Stephen had told police he was at the plant in Dayton until 5. The contradiction landed like a bomb. Detectives pulled him into an interview room, and for one terrible week, the town's whispers turned toward the father. The truth, when it came, was almost unbearably small. Stephen had lied about leaving work early because he was hiding a surprise. Laura's birthday was that Friday, and he had slipped out of the plant to buy her a necklace at a jewelry store in town. The receipt was stamped 331. The store's camera showed him at the counter, smiling, asking the clerk to gift wrap it. At the exact minutes his daughter was being taken 2 streets away. He was cleared completely, but something in the marriage cracked that week that took years to mend, because Laura had watched the police look at her husband, and Stephen had watched his wife wonder, just for a moment, and neither of them ever forgot it. Suspicion is a poison, and it does not ask permission before it spreads. The leads kept coming, and they kept collapsing. A registered offender in Greenville, 2 towns over, was pulled in within the first week. 8 co-workers put him on a roofing site 40 miles away all afternoon. Cleared. A drifter who had been seen near Millfield Park that morning became the town's favorite suspect for a month, until bus station footage showed him boarding a 240 coach to Columbus, 35 minutes before the dismissal bell rang. Cleared. Then there was the creek. Because the backpack was found behind the hedge, Some investigators believed Hannah had wandered off the route on her own, maybe chasing a cat, maybe playing, and had come to grief somewhere between the hedge and Miller Creek. Divers went into the water twice. Volunteers walked the banks until the frost came. They found nothing, because there was nothing to find. And here the case reveals its cruelest mechanism, the one nobody understood until 9 years later. The backpack had not fallen behind that hedge. It had been placed there, gently, deliberately, by the person who took Hannah, a person who understood exactly how small-town searchers think. A backpack dropped along the route whispers that a child wandered. It points eyes toward creeks and culverts and cornfields. It points them away from the one question that mattered. Who did Hannah trust enough to walk to a car with, in daylight, without making a single sound? Because that was the detail that never fit. Hannah was not a child who talked to strangers. Her parents had drilled it into her. The crossing guards saw no fear in her face. The dogs found no sign of a struggle. Whoever took Hannah did not grab her. Hannah went with them, which meant Hannah knew them. Whitfield circled that thought for years, the way your tongue circles a broken tooth. He reread the school interviews. He reread the neighbor's note about a beige sedan. He stared at his list of 34 school employees, all interviewed, all cooperative, all cleared. And one line in one file never once raised its hand. A lunchroom aide named Carol Pratt, hired in August of 2000, quiet, well-liked, no record, who 2 weeks after the disappearance gave her notice, telling the school she had to move away to care for a sick sister. People leave jobs. People move. In a file of 400 names, it looked like nothing. No alarm, no flag, no second interview. Interview 31 closed her folder, packed her house, and drove out of Millfield with the truth buckled into the back seat. And then came the years. If you have never lived inside an unsolved disappearance, it is almost impossible to describe what time does to a family. There is a name for it now. Ambiguous loss, grief without a body, mourning without an ending, a wound that cannot close, because no one will tell you whether to hope or to bury. The Bennetts lived in that limbo for 9 years. 2002. The flyers on the poles began to fade, Hannah's face bleaching pale in the sun. Laura replaced them. They faded again. She replaced them again. Watched the tape curl in the January cold. Watched strangers stop reading them. Watched the town's eyes slide away from her in the grocery store, because nobody knows what to say to the mother of a missing child. So eventually they say nothing at all. 2003. The case went officially cold. The tip line, which had once rung 40 times a day, rang twice a month. Psychics and cranks. The FBI scaled back. Whitfield did not. He kept the file on the corner of his desk, not in the cabinet, on the desk, where he had to see it every morning. He reread it every October 9th, cover to cover, on his own time. 2004. An anonymous caller swore Hannah was living at a campground in Florida. The tip consumed 4 months, 2 flights, and the last of the Bennett savings before it dissolved into nothing. Hope, the family learned, has a crushing weight all its own. Every sighting resurrected Hannah, and every dead end killed her again. Inside the house on Birchwood Lane, time did strange things. Hannah's bedroom stayed exactly as she left it. The bed made, the stuffed rabbit on the pillow, 6-year-old clothes hanging in the closet of a child who would now be 9, then 10, then 12. Laura dusted the room every Sunday. Stephen could not walk past the door. They received age progression images from the specialists. Hannah at 8, Hannah at 10, Hannah at 12, computer guesses of a face they were forgetting in fragments, and Laura taped each one inside the kitchen cupboard, where she could look at it privately and grieve a stranger. And Jacob. Jacob turned 11, then 13, then 16, carrying a guilt no child should ever hold. He was supposed to walk her home. He had stayed for a basketball game. He stopped playing basketball entirely, that season and forever. He grew quiet, got into fights he never explained, and one night when he was 14, Laura found him sitting on the floor of Hannah's room in the dark, and he looked up at her and said, "It was 8 minutes, Mom." I was 8 minutes behind her. There are sentences that break a mother's heart twice, once for the missing child, and once for the one still there, paralyzed by fear that he had destroyed his family. Laura and Stephen endured. That is the only honest word. Their marriage bent under the silence, under the birthday that was forever ruined, under the empty chair at Thanksgiving, and somehow it did not break. Endurance is not the same as healing. It is just refusing to let go of the rope. By 2008, Millfield had mostly stopped talking about Hannah Bennett. The flyers were gone. The town had grieved and moved on, the way towns do. But that same summer, quietly, With no idea she was carrying the seed of a miracle, Hannah's old kindergarten teacher retired, packed up her classroom sticker jar, and moved 400 miles south to Tennessee to be near her grandchildren. In the next part of this story, everything you think you know about this case is going to turn upside down. If you want to know what happened next, like this video, and share it with someone who loves true stories, because what that teacher found is the reason this story exists. Now this story has to do something difficult. It has to take you inside the other life, the one being lived 400 miles away, while a mother in Ohio dusted an empty bedroom. In Ashwood, Tennessee, a small town folded into the hills east of Knoxville, there lived a soft-spoken widow named Carol Sullivan and her homeschooled daughter, Katie. That is what the neighbors would have told you. Carol kept a vegetable garden. Katie rode a green bicycle up and down Larkspur Lane. They went to church some Sundays and kept to themselves. And in a place like Ashwood, keeping to yourself is a respected way of life. Nobody asked questions. There was nothing to ask about. But Carol Sullivan did not exist. Her real name was Carol Jean Pratt. And to understand what she did, you have to go back to Indiana, to 1998, to a hospital room where her 6-year-old daughter, her only child, a blonde, brown-eyed girl named Katie Pratt, died of bacterial meningitis in the space of 3 days. Fine on Monday, feverish on Tuesday, gone by Thursday. Carol's husband left within a year, the way some marriages drown in grief, and Carol broke. Quietly, invisibly, in the way that never gets noticed, she broke. There was no scene, no hospitalization, no record. She simply stopped living in the world where her daughter had died and started looking for the door back into the one where Katie was still alive. In August of 2000, she moved to Millfield, Ohio, and took a job as a lunchroom aide at the elementary school. Perhaps at first, it was only to be near children, but then a first grader came through her lunch line. Blonde hair in braids, brown eyes, gap-toothed smile, 6 years old, the age Katie had been, the age Katie would forever be. To Carol's shattered mind, the resemblance was not a resemblance. It was a haunting. It was a message. For a year she was kindness itself, an extra cookie on the tray, a wink. She learned the child's routine the way only invisible people can, learned that her brother walked her home at 3:15, learned the route, learned the quiet stretch of 3rd Street past the hedge. And on the 9th of October 2001, when the boy stayed behind for a basketball game and the little girl reached the corner alone, a beige sedan eased to the curb, and a face Hannah knew and trusted, a face from the lunch line, leaned across the seat and said, "Sweetheart, your mommy asked me to pick you up." There was no struggle because there was no fear. Hannah climbed in. The door closed with the softest sound in the world, and a family 2 blocks away was destroyed. Carol unclipped the unicorn keychain and set the backpack behind the hedge, and drove away at exactly the speed limit. What happened afterward was not the horror the word kidnapping usually carries, and that is its own kind of tragedy. Carol never hurt her. Carol adored her. She told the crying child that her family had been in a terrible accident, that mommy and daddy were gone, that she was her Aunt Carol, and that her new name, her real special name, was Katie. A 6-year-old cannot audit a lie told through tears by a gentle adult who feeds her and holds her. The crying stopped after months. The name held after a year or two. Memory, at 6, is soft clay. Ohio faded into fragments, a porch light, a brother's laugh, a jar of stickers, dream pieces Katie Sullivan learned not to mention, because they made her mother go pale and quiet. Hannah Bennett did not know she was missing. That was the perfect, terrible genius of it. She was loved, in a stolen life, by the broken woman who had stolen it. For 7 years the lie held, because Carol had built its walls out of the one material that never cracks in a small town, ordinariness. Homeschooling kept Katie out of every database. No pediatrician who might remember an old scar, no class photos, no paper trail. But in 2008, Tennessee tightened its homeschool reporting rules, and a widow with no assets could not risk an inspector at her door. So Carol did the one thing she had spent 7 years avoiding. She enrolled Katie Sullivan in the 7th grade at Ashwood Middle School, with a birth certificate she had bought years earlier from a forger in Memphis. And schools, as every parent knows, do one thing without fail. Every single year, they take pictures. That same summer, June of 2008, Eleanor Voss retired after 31 years of teaching kindergarten in Millfield, Ohio, and moved to Ashwood, Tennessee, where her daughter Dana lived, to be near her granddaughter Megan. Of all the towns in America, of all the school districts, Megan Riley attended Ashwood Middle School, one grade behind a quiet girl named Katie Sullivan. For 2 years, they moved past each other, the retired teacher and the stolen child, at the same grocery store, the same church bake sales, the same traffic light, never once meeting. And then came Tuesday, May 18th, 2010. Yearbooks had been handed out at Ashwood Middle that morning. Megan brought hers to her grandmother's kitchen table after school, flipping pages to show off her class picture. Eleanor put on her reading glasses. She admired Megan's photo. She turned the page, and her heart stopped. Page 41, 8th grade, 3rd row, 4th from the left. A girl with braces and long, dirty blonde hair, caught mid-smile, head tilted shyly away from the camera. The caption read, Katie Sullivan. Eleanor did not see a stranger. She saw a doorway in Millfield, Ohio, 9 years earlier, and a small girl arriving at it every morning for a sticker. Good morning, Miss Hannah. Some faces you forget. Not the ones you greeted at your classroom door for 180 mornings. Not the ones you searched for in the rain. The tilt of the head. The shape of the brow. And there, thin and white and unmistakable in the glossy print, the little scar through the left eyebrow, the one Hannah had gotten falling off a swing, the one Eleanor used to touch gently while telling her she was brave. Eleanor sat at that kitchen table for a long time, holding the yearbook, her tea going cold, doing the math with shaking hands. Hannah Bennett would be 15 now. This girl was 15. She asked Megan, as casually as a grandmother can, "Do you know this girl, Katie Sullivan?" Megan shrugged. Kind of quiet, homeschooled before, lives with her mom over on Larkspur. Her mom is really protective. That night, Eleanor barely slept. She knew what a phone call would do to Laura Bennett. She had watched that woman age a decade in a year. To hand her hope and be wrong would be an act of cruelty. But to stay silent and be right, that would be unforgivable. She thought of every fading flyer she had ever walked past. If you have ever held a piece of information that could either heal a stranger or destroy them, you know the weight Eleanor Voss carried to bed that night. In the morning, she made 2 calls. The first was to a number she still knew by heart, the Millfield Police Department, where she asked for a detective she prayed still worked there. The second, with his blessing, was to Laura. "Laura," she said, her voice steady as a teacher's. "It's Eleanor Voss. I need you to sit down, honey. I think I found her." Ray Whitfield was 53 years old and 9 years grayer when the front desk told him a retired kindergarten teacher was on the line about the Bennett case. He had taken hundreds of calls like it. Psychics, cranks, good-hearted people who had seen a blonde girl at a rest stop. But Eleanor Voss did not sound like any of them. She did not say, "I saw a girl who looks like Hannah." She said, "I taught that face for a year. I can see her scar, and I can tell you the page number." Whitfield pulled the file that had never left his desk, and by that evening, he was on the phone with the FBI field office in Knoxville. Agent Patricia Lorne took the case, and the first thing her team did was quietly request the school records for one Katie Sullivan, 8th grade, Ashwood Middle School. What came back made the hair on Whitfield's arms stand up. The Tennessee birth certificate on file said Katie Marie Sullivan, born March of 1995. But the hospital named on the certificate had no record of the birth, none. The attending physician listed on the document had died in 1994, a full year before he supposedly delivered this child. The certificate was a forgery, a good one, the kind you buy, not the kind you make. Then they pulled the mother. Carol Sullivan had a Tennessee driver's license, a modest bank account, a small paid-for house on Larkspur Lane, and absolutely nothing else. No tax history before 2002, no previous address that checked out, no marriage record for the husband she claimed to have buried. The woman had simply appeared, fully formed, with a daughter, the year after Hannah Bennett vanished. People do not appear. People are built, and someone had built Carol Sullivan carefully. Lorne's analysts began pulling threads, and one of them, cross-checking names, found it. Carol Jean Pratt. A lunchroom aide on the Millfield Elementary staff list from 2001. Interviewed October 18th. Cleared. Resigned 2 weeks later. And attached to an Indiana records search under the name Pratt. A death certificate from 1998 for a 6-year-old girl. Katie Whitfield read the old interview transcript alone in his office that night. 31 of 34. A page and a half he had personally signed off on 9 years earlier. "Did you know Hannah Bennett? Only from the lunch line. Sweet little thing. I hope you find her." He sat with the crushing weight of it, the answer that had been in his own handwriting the whole time, and then he did what good investigators do. He set the guilt aside and went to work. Surveillance began within days, careful and distant. Photographs of a 15-year-old girl walking to school, laughing with a friend at a bus stop, carrying a library book. The Bureau's forensic team laid those photographs beside the age progression image of Hannah Bennett at 14. The match was not close. It was uncanny. Same jaw, same brow, same scar, but a photograph is not proof, and everyone involved understood the stakes of being wrong. There was a girl at the center of this. A girl who by every observation was healthy, settled, and utterly unaware, and one clumsy step could shatter two families instead of healing one. A judge in Knoxville reviewed the forged certificate, the vanished history, the Indiana death record, the photographs, and signed the order the same afternoon. A DNA test, conducted quietly at the school, with a child psychologist present, before anyone knocked on the door of the little gray house on Larkspur Lane. In Millfield, Laura Bennett waited by the phone, under strict instructions to tell no one, holding hope in both hands like water, terrified of how much of it was already leaking through her fingers. On the morning of May 28, 2010, a counselor called Katie Sullivan out of her second period class. In a quiet office, with a psychologist beside her and Agent Lorne speaking as gently as her job ever allowed, they told the 15-year-old only what she needed to hear. There was a question about her records. They needed to run a simple test. A cotton swab inside the cheek. 10 seconds. Nothing more. Katie was confused, a little scared, and polite. She kept asking if her mom knew, if her mom was okay. 10 seconds. A sealed envelope, a courier to the lab, and then the wait. 4 days. If you have ever waited on a phone call that would decide the rest of your life, you know what those 4 days did to Laura Bennett. She did not sleep. She cleaned Hannah's room 3 times. She took the age progression picture out of the kitchen cupboard and set it on the table across from her coffee cup, and she and the stranger in the picture waited together. On June 1st, the results came back. Agent Lorne called Whitfield first, out of respect. Whitfield drove to Birchwood Lane, because some news should never come by phone. He stood in the same living room where he had stood 9 years earlier, in the rain, holding his hat, and this time he said, "Laura. Stephen. It's her. 99.9%. Katie Sullivan is Hannah. She's alive." Laura Bennett made a sound that was not a word, that was 9 years leaving her body at once, and slid down the wall to the floor. And Whitfield, 29 years on the job, knelt down and wept with her. The next morning, agents knocked on the door of the gray house on Larkspur Lane. Carol answered in her gardening gloves. Witnesses said she did not run, did not argue, did not even seem surprised, as if some quiet part of her had been waiting 9 years for that knock. She asked one question as they cuffed her. "Is Katie all right?" Not, "You have the wrong person." Not, "I want a lawyer." "Is Katie all right?" Inside the house, investigators found a home that broke their hearts. Neat, warm, full of a teenager's clutter, honor roll certificates on the refrigerator, and in the main bedroom in a cedar keepsake box, 2 photographs side by side. One of Katie Pratt, who died in 1998, one of Katie Sullivan, school picture day 2009, 2 blonde girls, one face, separated by death and a terrible sin, and beneath the photographs, wrapped in tissue paper like something holy, a small purple unicorn keychain, the one missing from a backpack behind a hedge in Ohio, the one detail that had seemed like nothing. Carol had kept it for 9 years, the way other people keep a christening gown. In the interview room, she confessed to everything within an hour, softly, without excuses, and the transcript reads less like a criminal statement than like grief testifying against itself. She said the world had taken her Katie, and then one day her Katie had walked through the lunch line in braids, and she had only taken back what heaven owed her. The detectives fell silent, staring at the twist no one in 9 years had imagined. There had never been a monster on 3rd Street. There had been a shattered mother, hiding inside her own broken heart, invisible precisely because she was the last thing anyone was hunting for. And 40 minutes away, in a counselor's office, a 15-year-old girl was being told, as gently as such a thing can be told, that her mother was not her mother, that her name was not her name, and that her whole life had been a lie built out of love and theft in equal measure. The reunion took place on June 4, 2010, in a family services building in Knoxville, in a conference room with soft chairs and a box of tissues that would be empty within the hour. Laura and Stephen drove down from Ohio with Jacob, now 19, silent in the back seat the whole way, holding a photograph of a 6-year-old he had promised to walk home. They had waited 9 years for this room, and this is the part of the story that no one wants to hear, and everyone needs to. When the door opened and Hannah walked in, she did not run to them. She did not know them. She stood by the psychologist, a polite, frightened 15-year-old meeting strangers who were looking at her the way people look at a miracle, and she said quietly, "Hi." Laura had rehearsed 1,000 first sentences over 9 years. All of them left her. She managed, "Hello, Hannah," and the girl flinched, just barely, at the name, because her name, the only name she could remember, was Katie. If you have ever hoped for one perfect moment to repair 9 broken years, and watched that moment arrive as something awkward and aching and strange, then you know what it is to learn that being found is not the same as coming home. They sat down. They talked about nothing, about school, about her library book, because the psychologist had coached them. No pressure, no flood. Laura did not reach for her. Stephen gripped the table to keep from reaching. And then, near the end of that first hour, something small happened. Hannah tilted her head, looking at Laura, and said, "I used to dream about a porch light and a dog under a table. Did we? Was there?" She stopped. Laura said, steady as she could, "There was no dog. You fed an invisible one under our table every morning." Hannah stared at her. Somewhere behind her eyes, a 6-year-old stirred in her sleep. It was not a memory, not quite. It was a fragment, one true piece of a buried life, and it was enough for one day. The months that followed were slow, careful, and painful in ways the news cameras never showed. Hannah did not move home for the summer. She stayed in a therapeutic foster placement in Tennessee, finishing the school year, seeing Dr. Miriam Okafor 3 times a week, while the Bennetts drove 8 hours round trip every weekend just to have lunch with their own daughter, and through all of it ran the thing hardest for outsiders to accept. Hannah grieved Carol. She was angry at her, and she missed her, both, at full strength, at the same time, because for 9 years Carol had been bedtime stories and soup when she was sick, and the only mother memory offered her. The lie had been her whole world, and the truth had burned it down in an afternoon. "Do not blame her for mourning inside the ashes," Dr. Okafor told the Bennetts. The love she felt was real, even if everything it stood on was stolen. Laura, to her everlasting credit, understood. She never once made her daughter choose between her grief and her homecoming. In September, Hannah said she was ready. She moved into the house on Birchwood Lane, into the bedroom that had waited 9 years, and stood a long time in the doorway looking at a stuffed rabbit she could not remember, that somehow still made her cry. That first night, Laura left the porch light on, out of 9 years of habit, and near midnight she found Hannah on the front steps, just sitting, looking up at it. "I know this light," Hannah said. That was all. It was everything. Carol Jean Pratt went to trial in March of 2011, and it was unlike any kidnapping trial the region had ever seen, because there was no cruelty to recount, only a theft so complete it had left no bruises. The prosecution called it what it was: a child stolen, a family destroyed, 9 years of a mother's life served like a sentence. The defense told the story of 1998, of a fever that took a daughter in 3 days, and took a mind with her more slowly. Both stories were true. That is what made the courtroom so quiet. On the final day, Hannah asked to speak. She was 16 by then. She stood, in front of her 2 mothers, the one who made her, and the one who took her, and said, "She never hurt me. She lied to me every single day for 9 years, and she never hurt me. I want both of those sentences written down." The judge sentenced Carol to 35 years. She looked at Hannah once as they led her out, and mouthed 2 words. Not "I'm sorry, thank you." Some wounds do not come with clean villains. That is the truth this story leaves you with, and it is a hard one. Back in Millfield, the new normal took root slowly, and it was bittersweet, because the 6-year-old who vanished never did come home. A 15-year-old came instead, a girl who liked country music Laura had never heard, who cooked recipes learned in another woman's kitchen, who called Laura Mom for the first time on an ordinary Tuesday in her 17th year, in a doorway, on her way to school, so casually that Laura waited until the door closed to fall apart. On her 16th birthday, she had made one announcement: "My name is Hannah. It always was." Jacob heard those words and left the room, and his sister found him on the porch, and whatever was said out there stayed between them. But his mother watched 9 years of guilt begin, finally, to loosen its grip on her son. Watched him laugh at dinner again, watched him teach his sister to shoot a basketball in the driveway, 8 years late and right on time. Eleanor Voss keeps the yearbook. Page 41 is soft from handling now. She will tell you she did nothing special, that she just recognized a child she loved, and that is exactly the point. Whitfield retired in 2012. On his last day, he finally moved the Bennett file off the corner of his desk and into a frame. In 2013, Hannah stood at a podium at a missing children's awareness event with her mother beside her and said, "I was found because one person looked at an ordinary picture and refused to look away." Somewhere out there is another face in another yearbook, another crowd, another checkout line. Look closer. Nearly every scar this family carries is still there. Scars do not disappear. But a porch light on Birchwood Lane burns every night. Not in mourning anymore, in welcome. And the chair at the Thanksgiving table is empty no longer. Share this video, not for morbidity, but to create awareness about the thousands of missing children whose faces are still waiting on flyers and in databases and in the backgrounds of ordinary photographs, waiting for one person to look closer. Tell someone about this story. Learn the faces from your own town. Because a mother's hope, a detective's stubbornness, and a teacher's memory brought Hannah Bennett home after 9 years. And somewhere tonight, another family is still standing, at the end of the driveway, still watching the corner, still waiting. Do not give up. Do not stop looking. Because sometimes, against all the silence and all the years, miracles do happen.